Greetings, my name is Ev, and today I will be taking a look at more of ARRTX's really beautiful watercolor sketchbooks. I have two here that are new models, I think. So this one is more of a portrait format. It is, again, cotton paper. This one is cold press paper, so it's gonna have that little cold press texture. And it is 300 GSM weight of paper, so that's the thickness of the paper. And again, as you can see, the packaging for these is just as beautiful as before. So we have this organic paper that's a bit shimmery, and then you have a printed out paper with a really nice pattern. Now I'm noticing that this paper here has a little bit of a canvas texture. Even this little wrap is this slightly shimmery paper. So it is intended to lay flat, which is also very good. These are made with signatures. If you look at the side, they are quite small signatures of possibly 1 or 2 sheets. Then you always have this one that's a bit more stiff because of the ribbon, like the glued fabric binding this sheet to the rest. This is not watercolor paper, so it's just a cover. And then these are our watercolor sheets. They have this perforation here to make them easier to remove. And you also get a glimpse at that cold press texture here. The texture seems to be quite nice on both sides of the paper, so I don't necessarily think that these have a side per se. Some papers have a side that is a bit more pleasing to look at than the other one, but this seems to be quite nice. And yeah, it is designed with the intention of laying flat. And then we have the other one. This one is the similar idea as the one before, except that it's square. So you have the fiber shimmery paper here, the nice printed paper with the canvas texture here. It is also cotton paper, cold press again, and 300 GSM, so the same paper. The main difference is that this one is square. So again, we have this nice sturdy lid. Inside we have the cover. The binding appears to be exactly the same kind of signature as the other one. Like I said, this is a bit stiff to set open, but once you're done, you're good. And then all your sheets, the perforation there if you want to separate some of the sheets. So I will be going to do some tests on this paper, swatches, painting, all that. I will come back with my impressions. I'm really eager to test these out. I quite like ARRTX's paper, so this is going to be quite fun. See you soon. And I'm back with the sketchbooks. I did a good number of tests. The first thing that I did before the test is to select a pair of colors. So I had all of these picked out from my Roman Schmal paints, and I ended up going for the most obvious pair of colors, the Aquarius black for the granulating color and velvet black for a smooth color. This one is single pigment PBK 11, and this one is a mix of a red and a green pigment to get this black. So it is very smooth, and this one is very granulating. It is so granulating, in fact, that it became a bit of a problem, but I'll talk a bit more about that when I get to the tests. If we take a look at the info for both of these, I would think that they have the same paper in them. It would be consistent with the results that I got, but we'll get to it later. But then again, they have the same characteristics. So cotton, highly absorbent, color lifting, cold press, 100 GSM. The size changes, but that's it. The number of pages is the same too. And the pages are perforated on both of these. There's one little thing that I noticed that I thought was interesting, but you can kind of use this part here as a pocket of sorts, and I had not noticed, and I think that's interesting. Not that you could fit a lot of stuff in there, but it could be handy to quickly stow away a receipt or, you know, a bit of info or anything, just like quickly in this sort of hidden pocket. I did the tests on both paper. I did the same tests as much as possible. I used the same variables as much as possible. So the same paints for both, the same tape for both, everything is the same. I used distilled water for both because the water here is excessively hard. And later on, when I'll show you my quick little sketch paintings that I did, I used tap water. So we get the full spectrum of hardness. My water is super hard and distilled water is basically not hard. Before I show you the results of my test, I will will list all the parameters of my tests. So for the paper I use, that's what I'm testing. So it's these two ARRTX Watercolor sketchbooks. For all the tests, I used distilled water, and I use two colors from Roman Schmal. One is a granulating black. It is the Aquarius black color made from pigment PBK11. And the second color is a smooth black. It is velvet black made from a mix of PR264 and PG7. For the lifting test, I used a scrubbing brush from Rosemary & Co. It is their small The Eradicator brush. For the masking test, I used three materials. I used a painter's tape from Scotch, the blue tape. I used a washi tape from MT, the yellow one. And I used masking fluid from Holbein. It's their white and green label, but I put mine in a fine line applicator. For the smudging test, I used 5 pencils and pens. So I used a Caturdays Sketcher, which is a non-photo blue pencil. I used regular 0.5 HB graphite lead in a mechanical pencil. Then I used a standard Bic ballpoint pen. I used a fine liner from Faber-Castell Pitt with black ink in size 0.3. And finally, I used a Pentel Pocket brush pen. Usually these are all black. Mine is a special edition, that's why it has a pattern on it. For the eraser, I use a Pentel Ain eraser, the one with the red label. And lastly, for all of these tests, I used a very basic, cheap brush with synthetic hair. I don't think the brush I'm using is particularly relevant for these tests. It's more about having the right size for the area I'm trying to cover, but for all of the tests I used just a very basic, cheap synthetic bristle brush. I will start with the square paper. So you can see I've set it up in exactly the same way, and I've added a piece of tracing paper on top, just so that I can keep notes overlaying the page. I will start with the granulating color, and I will put to this side here the footage of me doing the tests if it's relevant. I split it up in 8 main tests. I set it up this way because it's adaptable to every size of paper. I basically just, trace half here and then half and then quarters, tape off a boundary, and each area as its own test. So the first one here is layering. I did a first pass as evenly as possible, and then when it was dry, I did a second pass, let it dry, and a third pass. Now this paint, I will say, the Aquarius Black is so granulating that it became a bit difficult to do gradients and even washes right. Like the particles are so heavy of this particular mineral that they settle down really quickly. So if you're not good about it from the start, it's very difficult to even out a wash. For granulating, it is the best color. This also serves as a good test for wet paint on dry paint. Really, there's nothing particular to note here. Everything seemed to have worked out fine. If you see any kind of pattern and why my color is uneven, this is entirely the pigment, it's not the paper. But also it's interesting to see that as I add layers, the texture kind of add itself to the previous layers of texture, and it's interesting for that. The second one here is lifting. So I did 3 tests. One, I just put down a bit of water, let it sit. The other in the middle is I wet my brush and I scrub it once. And then this one I tried to scrub to white. So just the water didn't do much. The scrubbing once, you can kind of see it, but it didn't do all that much either. And then scrubbing to white was possible, even if not particularly exceptional. But there's really nothing about this that indicates any particular paper behavior or any issue with it. It's the kind of result I expected from a good paper. Then I have my wet and wet test. So I pre-wet this area with just water and dropped in the paint, and it granulates heavily. That's the pigment, but it worked out fine. Then I have a dry brush test, and that also worked out well. Here I have a masking test. So I add 1 piece of the painter's tape, which is also the tape I used around the whole page, but 1 piece of washi tape and masking fluid. All 3 of them removed cleanly, though I will say you can see sort of a color residue under the masking fluid. It's a bit more yellow, the paper in this place, so I don't know. The thing is, masking fluid is such a finicky tool to use, and it really depends on the brand, the color, how old it is, how dry it is, and all of that. So I feel like masking fluid would have to be its own test that is just masking fluid, but it's still removed cleanly for the masking fluid that I use. Then I did a smudging test here, so I did 5 lines in order. They are the non-photo blue pencil, graphite, ballpoint pen, like a big pen, a fine liner, and a brush pen. And I let that dry for a bit, and then I did 4 tests on it. The first one is smudging with my finger. I just rubbed my finger over this, then I erased. Then that's supposed to be just plain water, but I think my water was a bit dirty at that point, so apologies if it's a bit gray. And then paint. So with the finger, the one that smudged was the graphite, which is not a surprise. Both pencils removed cleanly with the eraser, so that's good. There doesn't seem to be any kind of difference of texture on the paper, like it didn't seem to have peeled or anything. Just water, nothing moved. Really. And the paint, same again, nothing moved. This non-photo blue pencil is a bit waxy, I think, so you can see it behave a little bit like a resist when you paint over it, but if you do multiple passes, that resist effect goes away. And then I had 2 areas at the bottom. One was for an even wash, so I tried really hard to make this an even wash. And this one was for a gradient, and I tried really hard to make this a gradient, but like I said, this pigment is so granulating that it's difficult to get a good effect with it. But in terms of performance on paper, there's really nothing weird. There's no blotchiness that's unexpected. There's no weird patch in the paper. It took to everything really well. The only issue that I noticed really is when I removed my masking tape around everything, it tore off bits of paper. Doesn't show, it didn't rip apart the whole sheet, but I would see that, like, you're supposed to peel it away from the painting, like away from the page, and relatively flat and at a 45-degree angle. It's a method, but if you take your time, you might be able to keep most of the paper on the paper. I did it a bit hurriedly, but it's not very noticeable, and oftentimes if it's only like the trim of your painting, you can sort of use a burnisher and rub down the paper fibers back into the sheet, and it really doesn't show. So all in all, I think it passed all the tests with the granulating paint for this particular paper. I still have one test, but I'll get to it at the end. Now, the same tests, but with the smooth black. So, layering worked perfectly well. These are nice and even, and you can see the wet on dry. There's a little bit of a hard edge to the line of my wash, but for that kind of characteristics, I find it really difficult to identify if it's something that came from the paint or if it's something that's in the paper. I'm mentioning it because you can see it. There's a little bit of a darker color to the very limit edge of the washes, but it's nothing that would have me behave in any particular way when I paint. For scrubbing, again, it's the same test. So with just the water, you can see a very faint removal of pigment. With the scrubbing one time, it took off a decent amount of pigment, and then I tried to scrub it down to white. The pigments in this black paint are more of the staining kind of pigment, so they still left a little bit of a gray shadow, but I was able to strip off most of the paint. I think it would be fair to think that if you have a wash that is lighter, you might be able to remove most of it. And again, it depends. If it's a super staining pigment like a phthalo blue, there might be nothing you can do. Again, nothing unusual in terms of behavior here for this paper. The wet in wet here, again, I pre-wet this area, I dropped in the paint, and it's spread out in a pretty standard way. I think this is good. Dry brushing is also very good in my opinion. The masking tests went just as well too. The painter's tape, empty washi tape, and then masking fluid had kind of the same result on the previous test. So very clean edges, no paint that seeped underneath, and I still have this sort of yellow cast to the area that had the masking fluid. So that's definitely my masking fluid that does that. Still clean edges, didn't rip off anything. The main element with masking fluid when used on watercolor paper is you have to make sure it is completely dry, and also this is cold press. Cold press tends to do the masking things better than, say, hot press. Smudging also gave me very similar results to the previous test. So the finger smudging gave me a bit of a smudge because of the graphite. Eraser, the 2 pencils erased again very well. The ink didn't move, just the water, or the slightly grayish water. I don't think the gray cast of this wash is from the pens that I used. I really do think it's from the paint. But all in all, this is still a fairly waterproof result if you can still see the lines that clearly, and there is not a big fuzzy area or a very noticeable cast to the color of the water. And again, with paint, it's black paint, so it's hard to see if it picked up any of the ink of anything underneath, but it stayed nice and even and smooth. Speaking of smooth, the last two tests, the even wash and the gradated wash, even if I've been painting for a while, washes can be difficult to do. I wonder if I did a second pass on this one to make it a bit better. It's possible, but all in all, as you can see, the paper took to these really well. There was not any kind of issue, like no patch of the paper that behaved weirdly. It's the expected behavior for the way I painted these in. I painted these relatively fast, so I felt it was more of a good test to be a bit rough and quick with this paper than to really take my time and do this really thoroughly. I don't think that would give me better results in terms of understanding this paper, because the way I work is usually more on the fast and we'll fix it later side of things. The very last test I have for the square pad is this one. So what I did for this one is I took one sheet and I cut it in quarters. So I cut it, you can see on the back, I cut it in half and then in half and in half. So I have 4/4 of the sheet, and then I alternated the front and back. This one is the front, this is the back of the paper, and then this is the front again and the back of the paper again. And I wanted to have that, and then to do again the smooth and the granulating color, and then an even and a gradated wash. So all of these parameters are in this test, and I don't really see any difference in texture between the front and the back of the paper. If I jumbled these up and didn't give you what it was, it would be really difficult to see any kind of difference in texture between the front and the back of the paper, which is great news. That's what I like. There's really not much of a difference between both sides. For the rectangular sketchbook, now you will see, that's why I think it's the same paper, is because the tests are very similar. But you have the layering and wet on dry here, which again looks very similar to the one from the first test. The lifting test also gave me very similar result. You don't see anything in the spot where I just left water. The one-time scrub removed a little bit of pigment, and then the two white scrubbing removed most of the pigment, but you still see a little bit of it left. The wet in wet is giving me similar results. The dry brushing is also giving me similar results. Masking, smudging, and then the even and the gradated wash. It's very, very similar. Really, there's nothing particularly different. I think the only noticeable difference, I would say, is that you can sort of tell that I used this paper on this side and this paper on the other side in a way, because if you look at the grain of the paper, they don't go in the same direction. And if I do this, now you see that the grain all goes in the same direction. That's the only thing I can notice really between these two tests. Everything else gave me very similar results. For the smooth black test, again, very similar results to the other page of tests that I did for this smooth black. So layering worked out well. You still get that slightly darker line at the edge, but could be the paint, could be the paper, could be me. I've noticed that sometimes I get this art hedge to a color depending on the ratio of water I put in my paint. So I haven't really found the logic of it for me, but I think it is worth mentioning here in this case. The lifting is very similar, so a little bit of pigment came off with just the water, more pigment came off with scrubbing once, and scrubbing to white doesn't really bring us back to white, but it significantly lightens the color. You might be able to paint over that if you don't use a color as dark as the black I used here. Wet in wet is giving us a similar behavior of the paint and paper, dry brushing too. Masking, again, same thing, and still this yellow cast to the masking fluid. Similar results for the smudging test. The paint seeped a little bit in the just water area, but aside from that, I think for future tests, I'll make sure to have absolutely clean water for the just water part of the test, because I'm noticing this cast to it that I didn't see when I did the test. I'm noticing it just now. But for future tests, I'll try to make sure I have a little bit of pure clean water just for that one here. And then even wash, gradated wash. This one, you can tell I did 2 layers to get it to a better gradient, but the paper took it all in stride, and there's really nothing wrong or unusual or unexpected here. This is the same tests on the square paper pad. Now with this one, it's a bit more difficult to notice the grain of the paper, so you can't really tell that I rotated one of the sheets. But yeah, you can see the results are pretty much the same. And I did a front and back test page for this one as well. It's a bit more difficult considering that I have like paint that goes over the edge of the paper here, so the way it seeps in the edge of the paper is a bit unsightly. But all in all, again, we get the same thing throughout. There's really no difference between the front and the back of this paper, and very comparable to the results of this sheet too. As I did my tests, I made sure to write on the back of the paper everything that I used or everything that had a part to play in these tests. So the paint, pigment, the tools that I used, the type of water that I used, all of the tools again, what's the paper, and also the date. As a last test for these papers, I drew something quickly on them, inked it, and put some colors in it. I used Holbein paints for these, and I wanted to see just how the paper would take to my usual way of sort of sketching on my watercolor paper and then sketch painting it. It is not a very detailed, a very thorough drawing. It's just a quick little something to try it out. And I would say that it worked out really well. I love how the granulation shows up. You can definitely see the areas that were a bit more difficult or where I was a bit more careless, especially in this wash. But overall, I think this worked out really well. I did some dry brushing with white paint in the end over everything, and it stands out nicely, and I'm very happy with this. I also did one in the other sketchbook. Very similar idea, very similar character, just something quick. I wanted to have an option to try some washes, some gradated washes, some dry brushing effects and all of that. And I think it turned out quite well. I would eventually do something a bit more detailed, a bit more patient on this paper, but for a quick test run, I think these two papers did really, really good. So that's it for my review of these papers. I hope this was helpful. I hope you learned something. Let me know if you have any questions, if there's anything you would like perhaps a bit more detail on, and I will see about including it in future reviews or papers. A big thank you to ARRTX for sending me these watercolor sketchbook to test out, try out, and have fun with. I will have all the links in the description for where you can find more info about these, the different formats, the different paper textures, all of that in the description, so check it out if you want. That's it for me today. We will see each other in the next video, and until then, I hope you have a great day. Take care. Bye bye.